Once upon a time, in a land not too dissimilar to ours, there lived a king. And he was a good king in an age when good was something of an unfashionable rarity. He was very, very wise and very, very powerful. But he was also very, very old, and he realised that for all his great wisdom and his great power, he would soon have to leave his kingdom once and for all, and make the journey to the outside world of infinite darkness. And so, on the eve of his departure, when his physicians had finished all their head shaking, and his wives had wrung as many tears from their eyes as they could, he called his son and heir to his side. "Everything you see is yours to command," he said. "But be advised that better slaves are those who still believe they taste some freedom. Play the tyrant, but you must also inspire love as well as fear." Yet the son cared not for his words, and when the corpse had been dispatched, with much pomp and fireworks to the darker realms outside, the new king resolved to stretch the limits of his authority. He gathered all the people before him and told them that their every thought must match his thought. No will should exist save his will, and people being people, they agreed. Those that didn't vanished in the night, and their families soon learned to pretend that they had never existed. But still the king was not content, so he instructed the animals in his kingdom that they must now obey his commands. Horses should bark, dogs should mew, fish should fly from tree to tree exactly as he desired, and animals being animals, they agreed. Some of the pigs had to be culled, but no one minded because they tasted so lip-smackingly good, and the cats had to go because no one can tell a cat anything. But soon the people and their animals lived in perfect harmony, their lives precise expressions of the whims of their lord.
Every living creature obeyed their king, doing everything that he wanted to the smallest detail, sometimes even before he knew he wanted it. But still the king was not content. Living creatures only made up the smallest number of his subjects, so he gave out further orders. He instructed the waves should crash upon the shore only when he gave the word. He instructed the wind should not blow but suck. Time should not run forwards but backwards or sideways. It took years to persuade them. Soldiers slashed at the waves until their swords were soaked with wave blood. Wind and time were locked in the deepest dungeons until, starving, they gave in. The king ruled the elements, but still he was not content. There was one subject that still balked at his power: music. How the king hated music. Refusing to be constrained, refusing to be disciplined. A small burst of recitative flowering into a fugue without permission, or a cantata breaking out overnight into a fully fledged oratorio. "Will no man rid me of these turbulent tunes?" he cried. And the militia, now trained to obey the merest impulse, took him at his word. They seized the music, every les crochet and minuet, every breve and innocent little semi-breve, and threw them out of the kingdom. They threw them out into the outside world of infinite darkness, and music was banished forever. At last the king had his own universe. It was his and no one else's. He was happy, and no one dared point out to him that he had exiled the only means by which he could express it.
It was in a very quiet land. Birds sat silent in the trees, their beaks now stopped fast, their chirping and tweeting frozen hard in their throats. There was no longer a harmony to time. Seconds would race or trudge forward, or simply come to a listless halt. The waves crashed noiselessly onto the sand. For even within that, there was no trace of music. There was no rhythm to life anymore. And the king's people felt it worst. They had been slaves, but whilst they still had songs of liberty on their lips, they had been happy slaves. Some rebelled, and were put to the torture. But even the torturers, who had once calmed their consciences with soothing music, were unable to bear the awful glaring, accusing silence. The fact was clear. Anything could be born with music, and nothing could be born without it. And the king would sit on his throne in misery. He dearly loved his wives, but now he heard in their words no love returned, no tune, no melody. For this he executed them regularly. The women he loved, their heads rolling from the scaffolds soundlessly. The king himself, quite alone, weeping for them all quite silent. One morning, the king decided he would pardon music. He drew up a contract, stamped it with his own royal seal. Music was free to return from the outside of infinite darkness. And to bear the good news, he sent several messengers there. Some by hanging, some by stabbing, one or two by slow-acting poison. But none returned, and nor did music. The king was desperate. He called upon his sorcerers, his necromancers, and those who were trained in the forbidden knowledge of music resurrection. But it became obvious that the king himself would have to make a personal appeal to his prodigal son. With court physicians administering, and the last of his wives looking on with glee, the king slowly bled, each drop landing in a metal container, landing with a plop that managed to be wholly tuneless. And as he wavered between death and life, he stepped into the darkness and called out, "I have been a foolish man. I should have inspired love as well as fear. Please let the music play again. All its songs, its symphonies, and its sundry cores of works. Please give my world a reason to live."
It was 7 days and 7 nights before the king recovered, and he awoke to a miracle. Once more, birds were twittering in the trees, the clocks chimed, and the waves roared.
Once more the world had music, and his favourite wife of all stood over him and smiled, and at the tone of her lilting voice he felt once again that she loved him.
The people were in celebration, singing in the streets, whatever tunes would come to their heads, and they sang until their throats turned red raw. They sang until their arteries burst and gushed. They screamed their new songs of pain.
The king watched in horror as the birds fell dead in the street, as the waves struggled limply and then were drowned by the seas beneath them.
He heard his infant son cry out his last, his face bitten off by the savage lullaby.
The lilting voice of his wife that he had loved so much grinned at him cruelly for wrapping itself around her throat and throttling her silent.
The music raced through the kingdom, sparing none its terrible beauty.
But as the bodies of his subjects fell to the ground, their death rattles sounded like the rhythm of a perfect drum.
And the music at last came for the king.
"Why?" he asked.
"Because we have been to the outside world,"
the music replied.
"We have seen infinite darkness, and we have learned that we need not only inspire love, but fear. And with a sound of brass and strings so beautiful,
it stopped the king's heart.
The music swallowed him up whole,
and became the new and dreadful lord of the entire world." The scream had sliced through the silence like a knife through flesh. As the vibrations echoed from crag to crag, something deep within stirred, its sleep disturbed. Yet it couldn't sleep now. A scream hadn't been heard here for centuries, and the cries of the past had never sounded like that.
there had been a bellow, a roar, as if the very fabric of reality had been ripped apart. Not the shriek of a terrified child. And the cave wasn't empty anymore. Dust that had lain for eons had been displaced by the arrival of a tall blue box, dancing in the light from the fiery beacon that pulsed atop the structure. The low, resonating hum that cocooned the box was fascinating, and yet something deep within reached out, only to find its consciousness touched, pricked by another presence. A presence the like of which it had never felt before. A presence it found appealing. Something deep within awoke and felt the hunger gnawing. The TARDIS door slammed, leaving the Doctor standing alone, staring out into the vast darkness that lay beyond. He stepped forward, footsteps echoing away into nothing. The chamber he was in must be enormous. He sniffed the air as he walked forward a few more feet. Rank, he said to himself, coming to a stop at a sheer rock wall. Nobody's been here for centuries. He ran his hand down the wall, feeling the grain. It was warm and wet. The Doctor looked back towards the TARDIS and sighed. "I guess I'd better go after him," Allison said to break the awkward silence. The Master stood opposite, arms folded. "Well," he shrugged, "I can hardly do that, can I, my dear?" Allison moved to grab her jacket from the back of an armchair. "Do you think I should apologise to him then?" "And now we add guidance counsellor to my ever-growing list of new duties." The Master placed both hands wearily on the controls. "Miss Cheney, you will do what you will do." He flicked a switch and the doors swung open. Allison said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked the length of the control chamber and disappeared into the square of darkness framed by the doors. As the doors closed behind her, the Master cast an eye heavenwards. "Kids." Allison stepped from the threshold of the TARDIS into the stone chamber. She drew her jacket around her, hugging her arms tight around her against the cold. Looking around, she saw the Doctor some distance away, striding across the chamber. "Doctor? Not now. I'm talking." The Doctor waved his hand dismissively at whoever was trying to attract his attention and turned back to the sea of faces, their fixed, rapt expressions urging him on to finish his tale. "And so I said, the Slavian at the bar can stay, but the fella in the quark suit will have to go." After a pause, the entire room erupted into laughter. They even liked his jokes. This was the best party he'd been to since Woodstock. Now, where was that waiter with his champagne? In the back of his mind, the Doctor seemed to remember someone telling him he was drinking more these days. But a lot had happened recently. He had changed. Could they blame him? And besides, this was supposed to be a party! Allison stared after the Doctor. Had he just completely ignored her? He was now standing, with his back to her, hand in the air, seemingly staring into space. She was starting to think that maybe he was a few fries short of a Happy Meal. She shuddered as a drop of icy water landed on the back of her neck. She looked up. It felt like somebody was running cold fingertips down her spine. Sheer walls of dank, mould-infested rock stretched up above the gloomy roof. It was like some great petrified cathedral. Not far away, just beyond the motionless Doctor, stood a squat, crumbling base of rock. It looked like some kind of crude altar, but she couldn't be sure. A stone trough ran down from the altar. A trough for what? Whatever it was, the rock surrounding it was stained jet black. And where was that breeze coming from? She turned 360 degrees, but there didn't seem to be any kind of entrance or exit. There was a heap of slick boulders, piled up in a massive heap behind the TARDIS. Whatever had happened, Allison knew she didn't like it, so it was time to grab the Doctor and get the hell out of there. She started to move towards the hospital bed. Her nana looked beautiful, propped up by a ludicrous amount of pillows. "What's wrong, pet?" Nana asked, her voice small and croaky. "Nothing," Alison replied, confused for a second. She looked around the room. The flowers her mum brought every day, the plastic water jug, the heart monitor, punctuating the silence with its regular beat. "You're not off, are you?" Big, grey eyes gazed back at her. Alison smiled, trying not to look sad, just like her mum had told her. "Course not, Nana." And would you believe it, the treasure turned out to be nothing more than a lovely bunch of coconuts. The doctor's smile widened as his guests responded warmly to his story. "Dash fine story, old boy," said the Colonel, ruddy-faced, pumping the doctor's hand vigorously. "Worked up quite an appetite listening to your exploits, Doctor." "Most kind, Colonel, but, as I always said, you could work up an appetite snoring the day away in your armchair." The room fell silent, social tension ripe in the air. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Had the doctor gone too far this time? The silence lasted a second longer before the Colonel erupted into laughter. His face reddened a shade deeper. The rest of the entourage followed suit. Social grace restored. The Colonel slapped the doctor on the back and moved off, his eyes on the waitress who had just passed. The doctor smiled good-naturedly. The old rogue. Left alone for the minute, the doctor let his eyes roam the room. Where was she? Why did she always wander off when he was in full flow? He felt the gentlest of touches on the back of his neck, causing the doctor to scrunch up his shoulders instinctively. "Stop it!" he giggled. The finger persevered. "You know I hate being tickled." The doctor laughed out loud, turning and grabbing the hand, wincing as the acrid stench hit his nostrils, throwing his arms up to protect himself from the faraway blast of another explosion. The grit stung against his eyes. More bombs thudding in the distance, connecting with the scorched, decimated earth. He stumbled across the rubble, climbing as high as he could to survey the carnage before him. Spots of white flesh and ripped uniforms acting as markers for the dead beneath the ruins. Alison held her Nana's tissue-thin hand. She could almost see the weak pulse fighting its way through the vein in her arm. For her Nana's sake, she fought back the tears, biting her lips so hard it hurt. "What's wrong, Pat?" her Nana asked. Before she could answer, the radio in the corner of the room crackled with static before bursting into life. Alison turned, her arms in the air, surrounded by a throb of bodies, all dancing, arms pumping in time to the wicked beat. The euphoria was overwhelming. A wave of love rushed throughout the crowd. She moved close to Joe, their faces almost touching. "This is great!" she shouted, and let the music take her too. Her Nana stirred, eyes flickering. But then she was still. "It's all right, Nana. Go back to sleep." She squeezed the hand that she would have clung onto forever, but the touch on her shoulder pulled her away. "She's gone, love." It was her mum, face glistening with tears. The pit of Alison's stomach fell away, and she buried herself in her mum's chest. After a minute, her mum put her hand under her chin, and she looked into Joe's eyes, the music pounding, drowning everything else out. The doctor revelled in the laughter of yet another expertly delivered morsel of bon mot. Alison hugged her mum. The doctor giggled, swatting away the hand. The music blasted her eardrums. She loved everyone. The battlefield was empty, save for the doctor. Alone. Victorious. The beat goes on. The clock struck midnight. The audience laughed. The doctor frowned, looking into his champagne glass before pouring it onto the floor. Blood splattered over his shoes. He looked up at the other guests who were happily taking huge mouthfuls of thick red blood from their overflowing champagne flutes. letting the sticky substance pour in slow-moving rivulets down their chins. Something's wrong. Doctor! A lone voice, clear and bright in the room. The doctor whipped round, finding himself in the stark cold of the chamber. A shaft of light spilled across the stone floor, reaching his shoes. The TARDIS doors were open, shining like a beacon. The Master framed on the threshold, his hand outstretched. "Doctor, take my hand!" The doctor took a sharp step forward, but hesitated. A playful whisper breathed in his ear, a hand on his shoulder pulling him back. He turned. The party was still in full swing, a sea of faces, waiting for the next tale he had a part to play. "No!" With a definite turn, he wrenched himself away from the crowd and threw himself towards the TARDIS and the reaching hand of the Master, who grabbed the doctor and pulled him inside the TARDIS, his android strength hurling him bodily across the control room. The doctor was immediately on his feet, running for the doors, only to be thrown back by the Master once again. "Get out of my way! Alison's still out there!" "Do you really think I'm going to let you back out there?" "Look!" The Master pointed to the scanner screen. Alison was suspended in midair over the altar, arms pulled out to the side, her body convulsing as unseen terrors swarmed around her. The corners of the cavern were growing darker, shadows moving in from all sides. "Do you see them?" The Master squinted at the screen. "The shadows? Yes, most intriguing." The doctor bounded to the controls, pouncing on levers and dials like a cat. "There's obviously something out there. Ghost in the machine, if you will." The Master arrived by the doctor's side at a more sedate pace. "What do you mean?" "Really, Doctor, you can be slow on the uptake sometimes. You weren't alone out there, and I'm not talking about those hallucinations. There's something else. Something alive. It reached out to me just after we landed. A presence." "Why didn't you warn us?" the doctor asked, a note of accusation in his voice. "Even after all this time, you still can't bring yourself to trust me, can you? If you remember, my dear Doctor, yourself and Miss Cheney did leave the ship rather quickly. I believe the word I'm looking for is flounce?" The doctor glared. "It doesn't change anything, Doctor. There's still something out there." "Something in the rock?" "Exactly." The doctor fell silent for a second, his mind racing. "And something extremely hungry." Now, it was the Master's turn to look bemused. The doctor, meanwhile, began jabbing at this control and that, throwing random switches and pulling levers almost as if he knew what he was doing. "You've heard of the stone tape effect, I take it?" The Master groaned. "We're not going to have one of your tiresome lectures now, are we?" "I'll never forget how they jeered at dear old Lethbridge back at Cambridge. He was really quite shaken, but soon I rallied round. 'Thomas,' I said, 'the closed cloisters of academia will never embrace the free thinker. I should know.'" The Master ran a hand through his hair, fighting the irritation that threatened to bubble to the surface. "Your point being, and do I need to remind you that the delightful Miss Cheney appears to be in mortal danger?" "Now who's been slow on the uptake?" the doctor asked. On the scanner, the shadows moved ever closer to Alison. "Thomas theorized that the ghosts and ghoulies weren't visitors from another plane of existence, but simply recordings of extreme or primal emotion, and that the physical environment, in this case the rock, acted as a recording medium to preserve this charming scene for posterity," the Master concluded. "Precisely. When a person sees what popular fiction throughout the universe calls a ghost, their mind acts like a tape recorder, playing back the images in the stone." "But this is a slightly more tangible problem, is it not?" the doctor tutted. "Of course it is. We're not dealing with a mere recording, but the principle is the same. Whatever is trapped in that rock is sentient and feeding off our memories like some..." The doctor struggled for words. "Psychic vampire." Melodramatic, but somewhat appropriate. "Whatever this mood sucker is, I think it's been asleep for a very long time, and our arrival awoke it from its slumber, triumphantly." The doctor hit a final switch with a flourish. There! I've reprogrammed the TARDIS scanner to focus in on the psionic resonance within the Cavan. We should be able to see what Allison is seeing. Look. The image on the scanner screen shifted, as if through heat haze, and the Doctor gasped as a barrage of scenes flashed before them. A coffin being lowered to the ground. Wet, black blood spilling across an altar. The heavy beat of a dance track. Wet, black blood spilling across an altar. The tenderness of a dark bedroom. Wet, black blood spilling across an altar. Opening a present under the shadow of a sparkling Christmas tree. Allison pulling the trigger. The guard's brains splattering across the metal wall. The Doctor's hand slammed down onto the console. Wait, that isn't Allison's memory. I would hope not. Unless we're harbouring a murderer. We are. You. A quizzical smile lingered around the Master's lips. I must confess, the scene does have some familiarity about it. It's your memory. What exactly are you implying, Doctor? You and I, we are inextricably and uniquely linked to this ship, but you even more so. The Doctor pointed at the Master. I designed you and the TARDIS to be inseparable, and somehow it's your consciousness that has awakened the beast. The puzzlement was replaced with a knowing smile. How flattering. It's so nice to be the organ grinder once again and not... The words died in the Master's throat as his eyes spun upwards. A faceplate swung outwards, revealing the Master's android reality. The Doctor lifted his hand away from the deactivation switch on the console. The TARDIS shuddered, buffeted by an unseen energy wave. The Doctor grabbed the controls to steady himself. You didn't like that, did you? He shouted up to the ceiling, but the momentary triumph was destroyed by Allison's scream of agony on the scanner screen. Leave her alone! The Doctor nearly screamed, slamming his fist down onto the controls in frustration. The image on the scanner began to change rapidly, cycling through a cacophony of conflicting emotions. In the chamber, the shadows drew closer to the suspended form of Allison. Wave after wave of psionic energy slamming into her. One of the shadows took on a more human form, its whispery, incoherent form rising up, its raised arm brandishing what could have once been a dagger. The Doctor raced around the controls, flicking switches, turning dials, but nothing had any effect. You've had the canapes, he shouted at the scanner, and now you want everything else on the menu. The TARDIS was slammed sideways, and the Doctor was thrown to the ground. Behind him, the Master's metallic features sparked with tendrils of blue energy for a split second. The Doctor sat bolt upright, looking at his consciously absent companion. Still connected, he said quietly. I wonder. Allison screamed again, launching the Doctor into action. You're a leech, he called up to the ceiling, ducking underneath the console and returning with a thick coil of copper wire that was connected to the console. A vampire! He unrolled the coil of wire and ran to the Master, attaching two bulky crocodile clips to either side of the android's temples. Feeding on our emotions! The Doctor's hands were a blur across the controls, and the central column began to vibrate with power, throbbing up into the vaulted ceiling. An eruption of sparks cast a halo around the Master's head, the ribbon of blue energy snaking down the wires and into the depths of the controls. You used him as your conduit, didn't you? Recognized an evil almost equal to your own, and then you used that to get me. The Doctor glanced at the scanner. The shadows were drawing even nearer. And Allison, whatever you are, whatever evil created you, you must have caused terror beyond belief. The Doctor placed his hand firmly on a lever. But let me tell you, you've got nothing on my companion here. Whatever atrocities you've committed, he's perpetrated worse. And if it's evil you want, then it's evil you shall have. The Doctor pulled the lever. A wave of energy blasted from the police box's lantern, zigzagging across the darkness of the chamber to envelope the still suspended Alison. The shadows drew back from the cold blue aura cast by the energy wave, lighting up the chamber and the cracked and broken altar, stained with long spilt blood. The Doctor's entire body was suffused with coruscating energy, bridging the circuit between the Master and the console. His hand widened around the levers as pulses of energy flowed from the Master, streaming down the connecting wires. The Master's still form began to glow hot. Waves of violent power cascaded up through the central column. The aura around Alison burned incandescently. At first they cowered against the light as their victims had cowered centuries before, as they'd slaughtered and fed on the spilt blood. Then, as if the craving renewed its hold on their souls, they began to inch forward, dim eyes full of this new banquet. For a second, they seemed to grow, feeding off the energy all round, features forming on their wraith-like form. Eyes burned, nails tore through the air, teeth bared. Alison screamed, pain searing through her as the remnants of the ancient cult swelled up and advanced step by step to plunge the knife that would burst her heart. The Doctor screamed, the energy wave from the console lapping around his arms, the Master's memories scorching through his mind. Atrocities he could never have imagined. The shadows screamed, fingers clawing the air. A banshee wail, soaring in pitch as the wave reached its crescendo of intensity. Such evil to gorge on. Such loathing. Too much to contain. Too much to resist. Too much to... A final surge of raw power flared across the cavern, splintering the shadows one by one as the cacophony reached its peak. The ancient altar, cracked and ancient, exploded into dust, the final victim of the tidal wave of hate. As the echo died, Alison's body thudded to the ground, and then silence. Alison pulled the tartan blanket closer as the Doctor draped it over her shoulders, absently pulling at a thread in the stitching of an old leather chair. She didn't look up as a glass was thrust into her still shaking hand. The golden liquid swilled inside. She sniffed it. Brandy. It's a good one, so sip it. Alison glanced up at the flaccid Master, leaning like a discarded puppet by the central column. What happened to him? She asked. The entity was using the Master as a conduit to the TARDIS, and us. His psionic essence, if you will, was broadcast by the ship on our arrival. It's curious. Neither my intelligence, nor the TARDIS's for that matter, awoke it from its snooze, but the Master must have something in common with the creature that struck a nerve. Perhaps it's because he can't leave the ship, just like that thing can't leave the cave. A shadow passed over the Doctor's features. Perhaps, whatever the empathetic link, no doubt boosted by the ship's telepathic circuits, was enough to trigger the stone tape effect, vampirism at its most primal and brutal. The grandfather clock at the threshold to the TARDIS's inner chambers ticked by a handful of torturous seconds. And so I was forced to deactivate him. It was the only way to loosen the entity's hold on you and get us out of there. The odour of the liquid stung Alison's nostrils. Isn't that a bit too easy? The Doctor didn't reply, looking absently at a control dial. I said, isn't that a bit too easy? He looked up. What do you mean? I thought he was your friend. The words seemed to faze him. Just for a second. He was. He is. Alison snorted with laughter. For somebody who's so clever, you can't half be stupid sometimes, Doctor. The Doctor narrowed his eyes. I beg your pardon? It doesn't work like that in the real world, Doctor. My world, you don't get to switch friends off when things get tough. I had no choice. Alison nodded sadly and sniffed at her drink. Considering another mouthful, she looked the Doctor in the eyes. What happens when you have to turn me off? The Doctor kept her gaze, but didn't answer. Alison threw her head back and drowned the brandy in a single gulp. The blanket fell silently to the floor as she pushed herself up from the chair and disappeared up the staircase to her room. The doctor waited for Alison's steps to fade into the distance before turning back to the console. He paused, thinking before throwing the switch. The master's body tensed as power surged through relays and circuits, motors and servers buzzing until all was calm. The two companions stared at each other wordlessly, the master's eyebrow giving the merest hint of a twitch. The android glanced down, brushed a flake of dust from his pristine cuff, and coolly strolled out of the control room, hands clasped behind his back. The doctor was alone, save for the throb of the engines in flight. As the clock struck an irrelevant hour, he reached for the decanter and poured himself a very long, very stiff drink. It's the eve of the Feast of St. Nicholas, the 5th of December, and a young girl is going to bed. "Now, you're sure you've been good all year?" asks her father. "Yes, Daddy," she replies. "Yes, I've been very good." "You've studied hard at school? Been helpful to others?" The girl nods. Yes, Daddy, I promise. I have. And you haven't lied? You're not lying now?" She shakes her head. No, I always tell the truth, Daddy." He looks at his daughter kindly and smiles. "Because lying is a sin, my dear, and we don't want the Krampus taking you away." "The Krampus?" She looked puzzled. "You don't know who the Krampus is?" "Why, he is the dark side of Christmas, the demon on the streets. And today is the day the Krampus runs." "Wait, should I be scared?" she asks. "No, not if you've been good," he replies. "The Krampus only comes for the bad children, the lazy ones, the violent ones, the ones who tell untruths. Santa will give you presents, but the Krampus will steal you away. So, you're sure you've been good? Yes?" The girl nodded silently. "Well, I'm glad," he smiled. "Then you've got nothing to worry about, nothing at all." He kissed her gently on the forehead. "Good night, my angel," he said. "Good night, my sweet one, and dream. Tomorrow there will be gifts." And so saying, he left the room. But she didn't rest well. She didn't dream. As the wind blew outside, her mind raced with thoughts of the creature that stalked the streets. Branches scraped against her window. Slowly, the seconds passed, turning into minutes, turning into hours. She was sure she'd been good, but all the while, she thought about the Krampus. What if she was wrong? What if there was something she'd forgotten? And then, suddenly, there was a noise downstairs. "Hello? Is somebody there? Who is it? No, this is wrong. I haven't done anything." A tread on the stair below. "No, go away." And another. And another. And another. Something was getting closer. "Oh, please don't do this. Don't do this. I want things to stay the way they are." And still, the steps got nearer. Still, they kept on walking. Now they were on the landing. Now they were at the door. "No, leave me, please. Leave me alone. Let me be. No!" Her father stood outside, a glass in hand. "My darling, what is it? What's the matter?" I thought... I just went to get some water. Are you all right?" "I thought you were the Krampus." "The Krampus?" He frowned, and then chuckled and smiled indulgently. "Oh, dear thing. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The Krampus isn't real. I didn't mean to scare you. It's just made up. It's just a story. Yes, it's a cautionary tale. A fable to make children behave, that's all. Don't worry, it's not true." "Not..." She looked at him, and her eyes widened in horror. You mean it's a lie?" "Yes, it's Oh." And then the beast leapt from the shadows and snatched her father away. The Daleks and the Time Lords scream in vain, too far away to stop him now. And so the Doctor stands alone. He looks out from his eyrie, across the wreckage of 1,000 worlds. Below him, fragments of the Time War, broken reefs of Gallifrey and Skaro washed up into this backwater to rot. His creaking wooden platform shivers with ice, a mile high, atop fragments of Morbius's red capital, its vile towers fused into the black, friable spires of Yarfling's church. And yet the Doctor can see glimpses of Earth. The planet had been replicated 1,000,000 times to become the bullets fired into the Nightmare Child's skull, and now splinters of human society have gouged themselves into the wasteland below. Relics of Mumbai, shards of Manhattan, a satire of old London town, remnants of better days. The Doctor looks down. Her skeleton lies at his feet. The bones relax into dust, and she's gone. The Doctor looks up. In front of him, at the edge of the platform, a brass handle, mounted in a single oak casement, the only remaining extrusion of the moment into this world, the rest of its vast bulk hidden, chained to an N-form, churning behind the dimensional wall, screaming to be used. He steps forward. He grips the handle. He wonders what his last words should be. He decides that last words are useless, pulls the handle down flat. The moment happens. The universe sings. The war ends. Surrounded by brightness, the Doctor sees the sky above parting to reveal, just as Betton and the Deathsmiths of Goth had predicted, the final event. Gallifrey Original convulses and rolls into flame. Its concentric rings of Dalek warships become silhouettes, then ashes, and then the Doctor falls. Every atom around him is sucked upwards toward the fire, but he alone is capable of falling, saved or damned by the moment's shadow. Above him, he feels the time lock solidify, sealing off the war from reality, and as his body tumbles out of existence, into plasma space, then foul space, then beyond, the Doctor leans into the fall, head first, arms wide, diving into infinity, alone. Except, there, something else. Falling, spinning, a whirl of blue, that faithful of blue, then a rectangle of white, widening, a doorway coming closer toward him. As the grind of ancient engines reaches a crescendo, he thinks, I'm going home. The Doctor lies on the TARDIS floor, his bones broken from the fall, his heart hollowed by his loss. Around him, the console room buckles, warps, shudders, still suffering from the High Council's resurrection of the Master long ago. It aches for a new shape. Me too, mutters the Doctor, with a grim smile, though he knows regeneration is impossible. The moment has fixed his existence, and this life is his last. He wonders what age he's finally reached. The Time War used years as ammunition, At the Battle of Rodan's wedding alone, he'd aged 5 million, and then regressed to a mewling babe merely from the shrapnel. Now, the ache in his bones feels 1,000 years old? Well, call it 900. Sounds better. Darkness swills through his mind, and he forces a smile, ready, and yet never ready. The end. Still no final words. But then, can it be? He feels it once more. That old, deep stirring in every bone and muscle and thought. The joy. The terror. The change. The impossible change. Amazed, he lifts up his hands, stares, fascinated, as the skin ripples with a curious new gold. Of course, she tricked him. Right at the end, her final kiss was not a goodbye. She imprinted the restoration within him. His life cycle has been reset. The new man, lurching outward to be born. So this is the meaning of her final song. A whole new body to expiate the guilt. He might even pass the restoration to another one day. Suddenly, they come in a rush. His final words. He says them out loud, but there is no one to hear, allowing them to be imagined and imagined again forever. Then his nuclei turn into stars. Every pore blazes with light. A volcano of thick, viscous energy cannons from his neck, his hands, his feet, his guts, his heart, his soul. It stops. The doctor sits up. The new doctor. Next doctor. Now doctor. He lifts up his new fingers to touch his new head, his new chin, his new nose, his new ears. He takes a deep breath into his new, dry, wide lungs, and he says his first word. Blimey.
The night of the Doctor. On the day I killed him, the Doctor was a happy man. Though, since what made him happy was a distress call from a terrified woman who died less than 7 minutes later, my conscience is clear. At the time, he was in his 8th and final incarnation. My memory of his appearance is a little hazy, but I have a general impression of dark hair, urgent blue eyes, and a choice of clothing that was probably intended to be swashbuckling. I think there were long boots, possibly a waistcoat, and certainly one of those overcoats with the kind of collar that young men turn up against the wind in the hope that someone might use the word Byronic. He wasn't young, of course. No one can be called young on the day of their death, when they are as old as they will ever be. But the voice echoing around the creaking wooden cathedral of the TARDIS console room was young enough, and more than adequately terrified.
Hello? Please? Hello? Can anyone hear me? The ship is crashing. Please, is anyone there? Can anyone hear me?
It should be remembered that this was the heart of the Time War. That endless, savage conflict between the Daleks and the Time Lords that threatened every moment of the time continuum. It is strange to reflect that the deadliest conflict history will ever know began between a race of traumatized mutants sealed into tiny battle tanks and an enclave of time-travelling academics who had sworn never to interfere in the affairs of the wider universe. However, the day came when the Time Lords of Gallifrey decided that the Dalek mutants posed a threat to all reality, and so attempted to use their time-travelling abilities to cancel them from existence. The attempt failed, and the Daleks used their own time-travel machines in a similar attempt to cancel out the Time Lords. And so time became a weapon in a war that could never end, and the conflict spread, not only through space, but backwards and forwards through history. Days became battle lines, and century turned on century. Divergent time streams found themselves fighting each other for the right to exist. It was said
one soldier could die 1,000 times in one day of that war and discover he'd never been born the next. And so, when the Doctor heard that cry for help, there would have been countless billions across the universe suffering in exactly the same way. But this young woman had an advantage over all the others who, in that same moment, were also screaming and begging for their lives. She happened to be in earshot of a man who mistook himself for a hero. The Doctor had always loved distress calls. They appealed to his vanity. He lived for the thrill of stepping through a door and seeing all those faces turn towards him in hope and wonder. The danger, too, was delicious. More than delicious. Over time, it had become necessary. Danger is the only true palliative for a guilty man. And certainly, the only drug strong enough for the Doctor. Setting aside his tea, it took him seconds to track the signal to a little gunship tumbling towards a red planet. There was one sign of life on board, and the engines were phasing. Clearly, there was no possibility of deflecting the ship's course, and a tractor beam would almost certainly shatter the hull, so a manual extraction was the only possibility. He would materialise on board, introduce himself as dramatically as possible, and get her into the TARDIS. She would be so happy and excited to see him. He wondered, briefly, how it would look if he took his teacup with him, but decided the risk of spillage was too great.
Please, somebody help me.
The fear in her voice would have broken any heart. The Doctor grinned. For the very last time, he slammed the levers, roared the engines, and sent the TARDIS spinning to the rescue. Although there was no one else to hear, he laughed and whooped. If anything sealed his fate, in that final hour of his existence, it was his laughter. I never wanted to hear that laugh again. The owner of the voice was a young woman called Cass Fermazzi. She was clever and brave and doomed. In later years, when I was able to return her remains to what was left of her family, I learned that she had grown up on one of the farm planets of the Gazrond belt and had stowed away on a star freighter at the age of 14 to see the wonders of the universe, and found there were no wonders left. Instead, there was a war that threatened all reality. At first, she ran, but one day, helping an old soldier die in a crater full of mud snakes under a burning moon, she realised there was nowhere left to hide. The following morning, the kindly medtech who closed the soldier's eyes unclipped the bandolier from around the dead man's chest and gave it to Cass, perhaps mistaking her for a friend or relative. Cass took the bandolier, tightened it around herself, and decided to start running in the opposite direction. 3 months later, she was crewing a gunship. 4 years later, she had survived the Nightmare Child, wept at the massacre of Skull Moon, and fought in the ruins of the Ulterium. On the last day of her life, she and her crew successfully repelled a Dalek fleet from the feeding hives of the Vantros. But then, as they flew to safety, found themselves under attack from one of the Time Lord battle cruisers, now as indiscriminate in their slaughter as the Daleks themselves. They were blasted from the stars for no better reason, Cass realised, than they were blocking the view of the retreating Daleks. She'd been the only one who didn't panic. She'd teleported the crew to the safety of the nearest planet, and, with no one left to teleport her, and realising that a safe crash landing was now an impossibility, she'd finally asked for help. "Help me! Please! Can anyone hear me? Help me!" She slammed the overheating console with both fists.
Please state the nature of your ailment or injury,
said the medical computer. "I'm not injured! I'm crashing! I don't need a doctor!" Cass screamed.
a clear statement of your symptoms will help us provide the medical practitioner appropriate for your individual needs.
A simulated face appeared on the screen and made an attempt at an encouraging smile, only marginally less comforting than the cratered surface of the planet now filling the viewplate. "I'm trying to send a distress call. Stop asking about doctors." It was the feed line that the hungriest ego in the universe could hardly be expected to resist. "I'm a doctor,"
came a voice behind her, but probably not the one you were expecting. Cass spun round and saw a man who was making a particular point of leaning casually against a wall. 1,000 questions lit up in her head. He was already stepping forward to the console. Where are the rest of the crew? Teleported off. But you're still here. His hands were now busy at the controls. Was he checking she was telling the truth? I teleported them. Why you? Everyone else was screaming. He looked at her and smiled like she'd passed a test. Welcome aboard. Aboard what? I'll show you. And suddenly he had taken her hand. When did she tell him that was okay? And she was yanked out of the command chair. The ship howled and creaked, and the main corridor was twisting and flexing so it felt like running inside a thrashing snake. There was a harsh stink of molten metal, and she could feel the heat of the floor thumping against her boots. Her sleep pod was ablaze, and everything she'd ever owned had gone. Where are we going? She managed to ask. Back of the ship. Why? Because the front end crashes first. Think it through. A joke? Was he joking? Was this man wasting breath on jokes right now? And where the hell did he come from anyway? Hang on. Did that mean he had a way off the ship? She felt a dangerous surge of hope. And in that moment, with a stomp of iron, the rest of the corridor disappeared. A blast door had slammed across in front of them, blocking their path. And finally Cass knew she was going to die. Oh, why did you do that? She heard him muttering, but he sounded only mildly irritated, like a man trying to reason with a fugitive bar of soap in a bath. Emergency protocols. She found herself explaining like it even mattered now. There was a silver rod in his hand, and he buzzed it at the door. What's your name? He asked. Was he making conversation? Did he really think she was in the mood for a chat? Cass. Oh, apparently she was. You're young to be crewing a gunship, Cass? No, she wasn't telling him her life story. This was not the time. I wanted to see the universe. Is it always like this? Why was she talking to him? If you're lucky, he grinned. And then the door was grinding open. Cass barely had time to wonder how he'd done it, before he grabbed her hand again and they were stumbling to a halt in front of... What the hell was that? It looked like a tall, blue crate, wooden, with panels and barred windows. Absurdly, there were printed the words, Public Police Call Box, above a pair of doors. And was that really a light on top? And there was something else. Although Cass had never seen this box before, something stirred inside her like a race memory. Even a newborn knows to love the sunshine and fear the storm. And with the same ancient certainty, she knew what this battered old crate meant. To her, to everyone, it was purest evil. He was pulling her towards it now. Instinctively, she pulled back. It's all right, he was saying, reaching for the blue doors. It's bigger on the inside. And then she understood the fear she felt. What did you say? Bigger on the inside? Is that what you said? Yeah, come on, you'll love it. Is that... The word choked in her throat for a minute. Even on a crashing ship, moments from death, it was a word that felt too dangerous to speak out loud. Is that a TARDIS? Oh, the look on his face. A wounded infant. The memory of better days and lost magic. Yes, he said, but you'll be perfectly safe, I promise. She wrenched her hand from his. Don't touch me. He started to reach for her again, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. I'm not part of the war, he said. I swear, I never have been. You're a Time Lord, he was. It was so obvious. The arrogance, the presumption. Yes, but I'm one of the nice ones. Oh, and now he thought he could be charming. Could they never understand what they were? Get away from me. Look on the bright side, I'm not a Dalek. She looked at him and felt the universe shift. But no. This is too much. I am old, and perhaps I'm getting carried away. Truthfully, no one can ever know for sure what was going through Cass's mind that moment. But I do think I can guess. For us all, there is a hill somewhere on which we would gladly die. If we are blessed, one day we will find it beneath our feet. That day had come for Cass. Dalek, Time Lord, who can tell the difference anymore? She said and stepped backwards through the door.
She slammed her hand on the red button and activated the incursion seal. Her ship, like all others, had been proofed against Time Lords, and now it was time to see if it worked. She watched him through the plexiglass panel, buzzing away with his silver rod. The door was shuddering, but it didn't open. Cass! Cass! It's deadlocked. Don't even try. Just open it. Please, I only want to help. To help? How could he think that anyone would believe that? Go back to your battlefield. You're not finished yet. Some of the universe is still standing. The joy of saying those words, of seeing them impact. I'm not leaving the ship without you. Those pleading blue eyes. That hunger to be trusted. More than that. To be worshipped. To be adored. Oh dear God, was she supposed to think he was a hero now? They were all the same. Those vain, willful children with their two hearts. But was he really going to stay and burn with her? Well, if that's what he wanted. Cass Fermazzi smiled and felt the last moments of joy she would ever feel as she said, "Then you're going to die right here." Best news all day. The ship was grinding and shrieking around her. The heat and light grew fiercer, but now it was exciting. "Cass!" he was shouting. "Cass!" Yeah, she thought, smiling into his silly, anguished face. Say my name, Time Lord, and die. Which is exactly what the Doctor did. Though not for the last time that day. And here he is at last, someone was saying. The man to end it all. The Doctor tried to move, tried to open his eyes, but nothing happened. He didn't recognize the voice. But whoever it was, she had to be talking about him. It was always about him when people talk that way. My sisters, the Doctor has returned to Khan. Yep, there you go. He was right. Him. He wondered if he should pop one eye open and make a joke. People love that. Or even sit bolt upright with a big smile. But when he tried, still nothing happened. No. Wait, what did she say? Khan? That rang a bell. He decided he should probably make a note. But then he remembered he didn't have a notebook, or a pen, or in fact the ability to move any part of his body. He decided to make a mental note instead, but promptly forgot what he was thinking about. Damn, why hadn't he made a note? The voice again. This has been foretold. We have always known in our bones one day he would return here. Ah, this was sounding very him. A long-awaited return, probably a prophesied battle against an ancient foe, rising from some terrible depths, he shouldn't wonder. All in a day's work for the Doctor. He decided to leap to his feet, swish his coat about a bit, and choose someone to make him tea. But the world stayed dark, and the rocks stayed cold against his back. Perhaps Cass could help him. He'd just saved her life, hadn't he? She'd probably be with him in a moment. One good turn deserved another. Now a hand was stroking his face. It was a very warm hand, or was it that his face was very cold? Oh, that was interesting. He couldn't remember why he was cold. The voice, close now, warm breath on his face. Such a pity he's dead. Oh, dead, was he? That was going to make things a bit more Being dead, the Doctor was unaware of his final journey across that barren world, and only the crows of Khan saw him borne into the cave where he and I would stand face to face at the very end. Ow! Someone had slapped him. There was a bitter aftertaste on his lips. He was somewhere else. Sitting on a stone floor. The wind had gone. So, maybe he was inside a cave, going by that dripping sound. There was movement around him. The smell of smoke and the crackle of burning torches. Now he heard a low murmur of female voices. Was one of them Cass? Of course. Cass must have dragged him to safety after he'd rescued them both from that crashing ship. If only he could remember exactly how he'd done that. He decided to open his eyes as soon as he remembered how. "Cass!" someone shouted. Good. Obviously she was here somewhere and safe. "Cass! Cass!" It was a man's voice, high with desperation, and so cracked and full of terror that it took him several seconds to recognize it was his own. The shock opened his eyes. She was old and robed in scarlet. Her face was creased and withered, but her stare glittered as she squatted in front of him like a wise old ape. In a line behind her, against the firelit rock, stood several more scarlet-robed women, younger, but as pale and hollow-eyed as upright cadavers. Each held a steaming goblet. "If you're referring to your companion," the old woman was saying, "we are still trying to recover her body from the wreckage. You were thrown clear." Oh, the wreckage. Cass was still in there. He remembered Cass's face and how she'd looked at him when she'd realised what he was. "She wasn't my companion," he said. "She's almost certainly dead. No one could survive that crash." "I did." "No." That awful word, so calmly delivered. He fought to let nothing show on his face. "We restored you to life," the old woman continued, "but it is a temporary measure. You have a little under 4 minutes. It had always been a rule of the doctor's never to panic early. If he still had 4 minutes to fill, it was time to start owning the room. 4 minutes? He protested. "But that's ages. What if I get bored? I need a television, a couple of books. Anyone for chess? Bring me knitting." "You have so little breath left. Spend it wisely. Watch me," he thought. Quick scan. 6 women in the room, including the old one. 2 exits. One was obviously the cave mouth, the other led deeper into the mountains. Wait, how did he know it was a mountain? Had he been here before? He'd heard her name earlier. She'd named this planet. And what about this cave? Did look familiar. Okay, time to parade his local knowledge. If he could just remember any of it. Hang on. Is it you? It is, isn't it? It's you. Of course, he'd got it now. "Am I back on Khan?" he said triumphantly. "You're the Sisterhood of Khan, keepers of the flame of utter boredom." The old woman's eyes flashed. "Eternal life," she snapped. That's the one. Going by the look on her face, he'd already landed a hit. Good. Time to give it a bit more swagger. He'd clambered to his feet, but as he started to move, he could feel his body shutting down, and the pain of it almost knocked him flat. "Buck up, Doctor," he thought. "It won't hurt for long." "Mock us if you will," said the old woman. "Our elixir can trigger your regeneration, bring you back." Oh, interesting. They were trying to help him? There had been stories back on Gallifrey that the Khan Sisterhood could assist a regeneration in a mortally wounded Time Lord. But why should they care about him? And anyway, did he want to go through it all again? To be torn down and rebuilt into somebody else? Just to see more of the universe burn? He remembered his old tutor, lecturing at the academy, telling them all about the change they dreaded so much. "You will walk into a storm," Barusa had said, "and a stranger will walk back out. And that stranger will be you." A stranger to himself yet again. Why? What was the point anymore? The old woman was gesturing to the goblets, held by the others. Time Lord science is elevated here. On Khan, the change doesn't have to be random. She moved among the sisters, pointing to one goblet, and then another. Fat or thin, young or old, he almost laughed.
He was standing in the sales room of his possible futures. Man or woman? She asked him pointedly. Ginger? He wondered, but kept that thought to himself. Ohila was looking at him, expectant now. He'd wondered how briefly he knew her name and realised how he'd translated the tiny inscription on her left earring. Good to know some of his skill set was still online. Why would you do this for me? You have helped us in the past. Had he? A memory surfaced of being tied to a stake in the centre of this chamber while wood was stacked around him and torches were lit. One good burn deserves another, he decided not to say, then realised he already had. The Sisterhood of Khan were never big on gratitude. The war between the Daleks and the Time Lords threatens all reality. You are the only hope left. Oh, of course. They were afraid. But why did everyone always expect him to be a soldier? This is not my war, he said. I will have no part of it. You can't ignore it forever. Ignore it? He thought. No one in the universe could exactly ignore a war that was taking place at every moment in history at once. I help where I can. I will not fight. Because you are above such squalid practicalities as the business of warfare. Yes, he thought. Yes, he said. Because you are the good man, as you call yourself. I call myself the Doctor. It's the same thing in your mind. I'd like to think so. There was movement behind him, and her eyes flicked to a point over his shoulder. A new look came over her face. Was that cunning, he wondered, or just cruelty? In that case, Doctor, she said, attend your patient. Two more of the Sisterhood had entered the cave, and between them they carried what looked like a sack. But then they laid her on the altar stone in the centre of the room, and for a moment he could find no words. She looked so small. Around her chest he noticed a bandolier. It was clearly too old to have been hers originally, and he wondered briefly who had given it to her. Someone she cared about, or had cared about her. The thought stung him. He used the screwdriver to scan her for life signs, but he already knew it was pointless. You're wasting your time, Ohila was saying. She is beyond even our help. I know! He wanted to scream in her face. Instead, he just said she wanted to see the universe, because it was true, and it made him ache. She didn't miss much. It's very nearly over. I could have saved her. I could have got her off that ship. She wouldn't listen. Then she was wiser than you. She understood there was no escaping the Time War. You are part of this, Doctor, whether you like it or not. I would rather die, he said, and meant it with both his hearts. Not a soldier, he thought. That was the promise. Never cruel, never cowardly, and never, ever a soldier. He knew what was inside him, the anger that could never be given voice. Death first. You're dead already, said Ohila. How many more will you let join you? He forced his eyes to Cass's face. No accusation there now. No hatred. No fear. Nothing. Just another broken child. Just another one. Doctor, if she could speak, what would she say? To me? Nothing. I'm a Time Lord, everything she despised. If she understood the man you are, and the power you could wield, she would beg your help, as we beg your help now. The universe stands on the brink. Will you let it fail? There was no scorn in her voice, no cruelty, no cunning, simple appeal. How many more, he wondered, how many more children crushed and burned as he stood apart? He must never be a soldier. He knew that, but it was like a whisper in his ear now. How many more will die, Doctor? Will you keep your soul pure and your hands clean? He felt himself gripping onto the stone table, trying to shut out that terrible, forbidden voice. What will it take, Doctor? The whisper continued. How many more will suffer and die before you act? It begged him. Ohila was moving amongst the goblets again. Strong or fast,
she was asking. Wise or angry? What do you need now? Blood and rage thundered in the doctor's ears. To his own surprise, he noticed he was unclipping the bandolier from around Cass's still form. Was he doing that? It didn't feel like him. He was now holding the bandolier in front of his own eyes, as if for his inspection. It was cleaner than the rest of her clothes. It had been repaired many times. Obviously, it had been of great value to her, and she had worn it to the end. Someone, somewhere, would have been happy to know that. Warrior, he heard himself say. O'Healer was staring at him. Warrior? I don't suppose anyone needs a doctor anymore. Make me a warrior now. It was his voice, but how could those be his words? It felt like someone else was talking through him. O'Healer was passing him a goblet. I took the liberty of preparing this one myself. It was warm in his hands, and its smell was bitter one moment and sweet the next. Get out, he said. All of you! He heard the shuffle of feet. The sisters were moving deeper into the shadow. Will it hurt? He asked. O'Healer's voice seemed to come to him from a great distance. Yes, yes, she said. Good, he replied, and raised the goblet. He was alone now, but in that last moment chose to remember all the times he hadn't been, all the friends who had kept him safe. Charlie, Kerez, Lucy, Tamsin, Molly, Frit, friends and companions I have known. I salute you. He looked to the broken child on the altar stone. And Cass, I apologize. The goblet was almost at his lips now. One last farewell to the man he had been. Physician, heal thyself. The doctor drank the poison and walked into the storm. The stranger awoke. His hands looked different. He pulled himself to his feet. Every nerve and sinew jangled. Wrong, wrong, everything all wrong. No, not wrong, he reminded himself. Just new, just new. He remembered to breathe, and even that felt strange. He was trying to focus on the chamber around him. Oh, the colour balance was wildly different again. The reds were a bit greener and the yellows were out of control. He knew he'd get used to it, but it always took a while. Sometimes he missed the monochrome world of his first two incarnations. It felt like a simpler, cleaner time. So many centuries had passed before he realised he'd just been colourblind. He looked around, testing his focal length, and saw a beautiful woman looking at him. Is it done? Asked O'Healer. Is it? He wondered. Is what done? And then he saw Cass, dead on the stone, and the sight of her hurt him all over again. Good, he still had a conscience, but something new flexed under that familiar pain, like the flick of a serpent's eye in the darkness. What was that new feeling? Rage? Vengeance? Was that something to worry about? He ran a hand over his face. Wrong. 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 No. Not wrong. New. A new face for a new man. There were no mirrors in the cave, but hanging on the smoother rock walls was a highly burnished section of armour plate. Some ancient relic of battle, it would do. The first thing he noticed was that he was now wearing Cass's bandolier around his own chest. When had he put that on? He glanced up and met his own eyes. There is a moment, after regeneration, when the guttering soul of the old man looks out through the eyes of the new. So it was the doctor who looked into the mirror, but it was me who looked back. And there we stood, the doctor and I, one man, face to face. An end and a beginning. My height hadn't changed much, I noticed. My hair was a little shorter, though still dark. Those urgent blue eyes gone, and in their place a stare like winter. For a moment, that stare troubled me, but this was a time of war, and I had been reborn for battle. I was ready to look on a darker world. I turned my new face one way, then the other. Was I younger? Older? There was something haggard and pained about me now, so it was difficult to tell. Standing before me was a man who had seen horror and no longer chose to hide it. Yes, I thought. This would do. This was right. I held my own gaze and spoke. The words came out in a cold whisper, a silken rasp, voice like a shiver out loud. "Doctor no more," I said.